Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be ranking the albums by the Beatles. This is a very important video for me as I am now ranking the albums by perhaps the greatest band of all time, the most influential artists of all time, the band that shaped progressive rock, jazz rock, fusion, experimental, psychedelic, indie, metal. The Beatles are such an important band, so I've taken this quest very seriously. I've listened to all the albums in order, you know, from the first to the last, and I've scored each one relatively. So I've been able to go, right, you know, where does this sit in relation to this album, and I've eventually come up with a scoring, and I've ranked them in that order. Just before the video, I changed the order a little bit because it still didn't quite make sense to me. But I think I'm happy with this. Now, normally when I do these videos, everything's at the top of my head. I have got some notes here because there's certain things I want to say about each album when I was actually listening to it. I wanted to capture some of the thoughts I was having as I was listening to each album. So I'm going to get straight in here. I don't want to be talking for hours on this like I normally do. So I want a good, short, sharp ranking of the Beatles albums. So we'll see how long this video is in the end. Right, so at number 11 by the Beatles from 1969, I have the album Yellow Submarine. Now, Yellow Submarine, of course, is the soundtrack to their third film. The Beatles occupy a certain space in culture, the same as Elvis Presley, is that they are one of the first bands to come in at the beginning of rock music. The period culturally before that, if you were a star, you made films. And Elvis Presley and the Beatles both made films. The interesting thing about the Beatles films, again, they broke new ground, and I'll be talking about that as we get into it. The third film was like a psychedelic cartoon. It's always been a favourite of mine. I love the DVD. The songs on it are fantastic. But on the whole, what we've got on this album is some older songs that have been released. We've got some new songs, 4 new songs, and we've got a bunch of soundtrack, you know, music that George Martin composed. And it's fantastic stuff. This is a fantastic album. This is the level we start. So the 4 new tunes on here are Northern Song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, and It's All Too Much. These songs are fantastic. There's a side of instrumental music, and it's great, but it does drop it down because we've only got 4 incredible Beatles songs on it. So we are starting this ranking with an album that contains It's All Too Much and Northern Song, which is one of my favourite Beatles songs. So this is the level we're at, you know. It's All Too Much, which is a Harrison-written song, George Harrison-written song. Any other band that would be on an album, that would be ranking it right near the top, wouldn't you have thought? So shall we move on to number 10? At number 10, I have got Please Please Me, which is their debut album. One of the most important albums in music history. A legendary album and an incredible album. When you put the album on, now you got to remember at this point, the album as an art form, as a statement, didn't exist. Albums on the whole were pretty much like a photo album. You know, they were a collection of songs. Their first few albums appear in America at different time scales as the Beatles broke into America. So they obviously first a success in the UK, then they went over to the America and conquered America. And so albums came out at different points. And so you get different lines ups of songs on their various albums. So this is the only reason I think that drops these down, is that these aren't coherent albums like the later albums. You've got to remember that the Beatles are going to be possibly the most important band in history in terms of creating the idea of an album. And they're going to go on a journey from being a very tight rock and roll band playing in Hamburg, you know, eight days a week, to becoming an all-encompassing studio band. And then in a way, coming back out of that at the end, this is the journey that you have with the Beatles. This album was famously recorded in one day. So what are the notes I've got there? The list I'm going on is now the sort of authoritative releases. So in later years, each album was bound up on CD and released, and it's those I'm going off. So the official release of Please Please Me Now starts up with I Saw Her Standing There. This is the moment. This is the moment when rock and roll begins to turn into rock music. This is the moment where, you know, American rhythm and blues, American rock and roll shifts to being performed by, you know, 4 working class, you know, chirpy lads from Liverpool, cheeky with a sense of humour. And where that becomes a very important thing. We are moving from the sort of superstarness of an Elvis Presley or a Frank Sinatra, the untouchableness, to the touchable, people we can relate to. This is the big shift. And you can hear it all on that first track, because although it's dripping with, you know, rhythm and blues and rock and roll, and it's cool, and the backbeats are even heavier than you ever heard before, there's a cheekiness there. Straight away, I Saw Her Standing There. It's almost got echoes of Leaning on a Lamppost by George Formby. There's that little thing, that little English thing, British thing is there right from the start. Now, when George Martin decided to produce this album, he wanted to record it live, and he went up to the Cavern and he checked it out, and the acoustics weren't good enough. This is an insane fact, you know, when you think that it could have all gone wrong there, actually. But there was a reason why George Martin wanted to do that. It's because they were a brilliant live band. And so this album, in contrast to what we're going to hear on Sgt. Pepper and all these later albums, this album was recorded live in the studio. It was recorded on the 11th of February 1963. I think that date it should go down in history as being the beginning of the rock era. There's cover versions on here, but there's also songs written by the band. This was unusual at the time. The presence of several songs written by band members, Lennon and McCartney, credited as McCartney-Lennon at the time, was unusual and marked the emergence of a self-contained rock band. This is the thing that has struck me listening to this. Suddenly you've got a band that does it all. They do it all. It's all there together. And this is going to bring in the idea of the artist. You know, we will have a go at pop artists when they don't write their own songs. They're just a front, you know. But you've got to remember the Ella Fitzgeralds and the Billie Holidays and the Frank Sinatras. That's what they were. We think that it's very important to for artists to play their own songs, write their own songs, perform them and sing them, because of this moment here in history. What else have I got? The music critic or the Beatles expert, Mark Lewison, later wrote, "There can scarcely have been 585 more productive minutes in the history of recorded music." And this contains classic songs as well as I Saw Her Standing There, as it's also got Love Me Do On, which I think is their first single. And it's got that incredible backbeat. Love me do. Ringo's incredible backbeat on there. And Please Please Me. Now, at this point, I want to set the record straight. There's loads of videos out there of Bernard Purdie going around saying he played on the Beatles albums. Loads of them. And saying the Beatles didn't play on those albums. Quincy Jones has come out and also said this. It's very interesting that guys at the time that were working in America know so much about a band that was recorded here in the UK. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. Before all this ever happened, when the Beatles were unknown, they were pulled in to make an album with Tony Sheridan. Tony Sheridan was like a rock and roll singer in the early 60s, I believe. At that point, Pete Best was on drums. Now, Pete Best, it has been said, was a weaker drummer than Ringo Starr, and this is why George Martin turfed him out and brought Ringo in when they got signed to EMI in 1962-63. The drumming on this album, which is basically a whole bunch of other songs, not famous Beatles songs, was actually, it's okay, but it's a little bit weak and it's quiet. A label got hold of this album once the Beatles were more famous and decided to release it. And when it got passed over to the States, the American end of that label decided to pull in Bernard Purdie to play over the top. He does an incredible job. Because the drums are so quiet on the original, Bernard Purdie basically just plays straight over the top of the original drums. The original drums are still there, and Purdie seems to somehow add this groove. It's an incredible bit of playing, but I think Bernard Purdie went into that session, didn't know much about it, didn't know what he was playing on, probably couldn't remember any of the tracks. And then a few years later, he suddenly noticed that this band is like the biggest band in the world. And he went, hang on, I played with them. And so he's totally correct that he played on an album worth of material, but nothing important at all. And I think this has now created the myth that the Beatles couldn't really play and they didn't play on their stuff. This is a complete myth. It's a lie. They were a really, really good band, and they got a vibe. They'd played so much together that they had developed an incredible chemistry, one of the greatest chemistries in the history of rock and roll. Pete Best was perhaps a weaker drummer, and so once they turfed him out, they went and got the best guy in Liverpool, who was playing for Rory Storm at the time, Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr is the session player. Ringo Starr is a mighty drummer. The fact that he plays straight down the line and plays with the song makes him even better in my book. So we've dispelled all the myths, and I'm talking too much. So shall we move on to number 9 on the list? And the number 9 is from 1963, a few months later, is With the Beatles. When you listen to the Beatles start off incredible and then get better at an incredible pace. Now, the big difference between the second album With the Beatles and the first album, Please Please Me, is that Please Please Me has been made in a hurry. You know, they haven't got much money. They spent one day in the studio. They finished the album. They go, oh, we need a cover. And they go, bring a photographer. And they sort of go out the room and they go up to a balcony and they look down and it gets photographed up. And that's done in 5 minutes. It becomes absolutely classic, of course, this album cover. By the time we get to this second album, we suddenly have this black and white iconic cover. Both of these album covers are incredible, but this one is very iconic. And the quality, aesthetic quality of that album cover, the difference between that and the first, just it happened on a day and it's just magic, is the difference between the first album and the second album. Robert Freeman, he took the photograph of the Beatles for this album cover. He before that had taken a lot of black and white photographs for John Coltrane, and it was those album covers that impressed either George Martin or the Beatles or both, which is why they wanted him to do this album cover. I want to point this out because this is the esoteric nature of jazz, and how jazz might not be liked by many people, and it's a minority thing, but the repercussions of what jazz musicians do, especially at that time, goes out, right? So one of the greatest influences of Coltrane on modern culture is perhaps the album covers being copied by the Beatles, because that black and white cover then gets copied by the Residents and everybody else. So what notes have I got? The opener is It Won't Be Long. This is more sophisticated in terms of chord structure and arrangement. All My Loving is the only classic Beatles song on here, however, but the quality is higher. I Want to Hold Your Hand was also from this session, but I don't think it was released on this album. The first George Harrison song appears on here, which is Don't Bother Me. And this is like it's an ingenious melody. You know, you've got these two incredible songwriters, and then on the second album, so we got this other songwriter, George, and he's also incredible. And there's a very quirky melody, and this seems to be pulling from sort of the music that you would have watched in cowboy TV shows. It's not country and western, it's cowboy music that you know, George Harrison obviously saw watching the TV as a kid in the 1950s. You know, watching Maverick or whatever it was that was around there. I've just made a random name up. I hope that is a TV show that with cowboys in for the 1950s. Probably not. I Want to Be Your Man, great song, rocking song. Has some great Hammond organ on it, which was played by George Martin. George Martin really was the fifth Beatle. He's bringing so much in, not just production-wise, but playing-wise, arrangement-wise. And he emerges here. He emerges here on this album. So that's what I've got at number 9. So number 8 from 1964, we have the Beatles. We have the Beatles For Sale, right? So I've gone Yellow Submarine, then I've done the first album, then the second album. This is not the third album, it's the one after that, but we were all in the same period as this band moving forward. Just before the Beatles For Sale came out, the soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night came out, and I think that's a groundbreaking record, and we'll get onto that in a minute. The Beatles For Sale, this also produced the non-album single I Feel Fine, backed by She's a Woman. So we're seeing them going into the studio, and their best stuff is being held back for singles, because what I think at the time, they wanted to sell the single and then sell the album, and they didn't want people to wait for the album. Single sales were very important, so they would do this a lot. What's my notes? There's a country music influence on this. It suddenly crops in. It's different. It's not just, you know, cheeky rock and roll on this album and little bits of La Bamba and all that type of stuff. What you have on here is a country music influence. And the reason why is because the Bob Dylan album has hit. And Bob Dylan's come out with his heavyweight songwriting, and he's changing music, and almost instantaneously the Beatles pick up on that. That is the conduit to rock music for me, is Dylan through the Beatles. And Dylan was so much more than just a songwriter that was writing serious songs. Tom Wilson, his producer, had come from jazz. He'd produced people like Cecil Taylor and John Coltrane, and he's going to go on to produce the first albums by the Mothers of Invention. And there is a big, there's like a heart of rock and roll being born out of this crossover at this time, and it emerges on Beatles For Sale. So we have the influence of Bob Dylan, we have the influence of country music, the arrangements are even richer, and the only thing that drags this album down for me is there's a lot of covers on it. And the reason why there's a lot of covers is because the Beatles are now, they're in sort of meteoric mode, and Lennon and McCartney just can't quite keep up, it feels, at this time. So, but in a fantastic album nonetheless. There's a cover of Mr. Moonlight, and Lennon really sings great. Perhaps the famous song on this album is 8 Days a Week. So I'm now going to move on to number 7. And now we're jumping right forward to the last album. The last album, Let It Be, from 1970. This is a controversial album produced by Phil Spector. I don't think they were happy with the production. And it follows the arc from the Beatles being a live band, going through this journey, stopping playing live, then turning the recording studio into the creative process. So in other words, their creativity comes through the studio rather than just being recorded by it. And this changes music, and then you see a gradual move back to them being a band. Let It Be is those guys in the room. Not always, and I feel that the best tracks on it, which is All Across the Universe and Let It Be and Long and Winding Road, 3 absolute masterpieces, weren't created like that. The rest are just really good rockers, and I think it's nice to hear the Beatles return back to being a great rock band. I think this gets forgotten. We tend to think something like the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin have been a really rocking band. The Beatles are exactly the same as that. All the way through this production process, this is a little muso thing I picked up on, is they're basically, I think they're recording the bass and the drums on one track, because they've got a 4-track. Then they're putting, I think, a stereo mix here, and the 3 tracks, so maybe they've got guitars here, and then the other tracks are for vocals. So the mixes are often, the drums are right over on one side to make a stereo effect, and the vocals are on the other. It's really weird, and this is why they're looking at AI to be able to pull out from these tracks, the individual tracks, so they can mix them properly. This is the only album, I think, where Ringo's drums are mixed down the middle. All the others, he's over to the side. It's very, very strange. Let It Be really charts the breakup of the band. and the breakup of the band seems to be coming from bad business decisions. And the musicians wanting to do their own thing. The musicians wanting to do their own thing emerges so early on. It's quite surprising. When you listen to the albums in order, you can see there's a number of years where they're sticking together and they love each other and they want to play with each other, but each of them have got their own vision of what they want to do, and it's all an incredible vision. I think this one is them really coming together. I think by the time this album had come out, you know, the band had broken up. Anyway, that's what I've got. Number 7 is Let It Be. At number 6, I have A Hard Day's Night, which is the one that comes out between with the Beatles and the Beatles For Sale, right? This one is a huge leap forward. The songs change. They're not just rock and roll songs. They're not just cheesy little pop songs. There is something else going on. And I think the reason for this is because psychologically, this was the soundtrack to a film. The film's a black and white film made by Richard Lester. And it stylistically, it echoes other groundbreaking British films at the time, like Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, A Room at the Top. And this is sort of the UK's reaction to the French New Wave of Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. Richard Lester is a groundbreaking director that uses those techniques in here, and it's really interesting because his first film feels like a documentary, but it's also got fictional stuff in. They're playing themselves. Hard Day's Night is one of the most important films of the 1960s, without a doubt. It's groundbreaking. The Beatles go into the studio to make tracks that were going to fit in this film. And so I think they start to think filmic. And the fact that they're thinking filmic, if you think what they're about to do, like later on Sgt. Pepper, that is the ingredient. So what we're seeing is the previous era where you had superstars like Elvis Presley that actually became film stars and were in films. What they're going to do is take the idea of the film, the filmic experience that you sit down and experience, and they're going to pull this into the album form, and the albums are going to become the new films for that generation. Right, you see, I think I'm onto something here, and I don't know whether that's been said before. A Hard Day's Night is important because it's a film. And as soon as that opening sus chord starts up at the beginning of Hard Day's Night, we know we're into another era altogether. This is an absolutely groundbreaking album. All the songs are Lennon McCartney, short, peppy pop songs characterised by layered vocals, immediate choruses and understated instrumentation. George Harrison's resonant 12-string electric guitar leads on A Hard Day's Night are hugely influential. And this movie persuaded the Byrds over in America, right, which are coming out the same folk rock tradition, to start playing that sort of electric 12-string guitar sound. It's born here. So we've got Dylan going into the Beatles coming out into the Byrds then playing Dylan songs. There is a dialogue going over the Atlantic Ocean at the moment. This is very interesting. The Beatles would be very influential on the American folk scene explosion as they moved from classic acoustic folk to electric folk in 1965. And this success enables the Beatles to open up the US market, not only for them, but also for other English bands like the Rolling Stones, the Animals and the Kinks. And this is very important because that opens the doors later to Cream and Led Zeppelin, and the complete, for a number of years, domination by the UK of rock music and the band scene. You know, so even now, if you start listing the most important bands in history, we are going to be listing British bands on the whole. What else have I got here? The title, I think there's quite a few titles. Ringo seems to have got his words wrong a lot when he was trying to explain stuff. I do the same thing all the time, and then people say, why did you say that? I do it all the time. I think it's called a malapropism, right? Why they would have a word like malapropism for this when it's a description of, you know, people who can't get their words out. It's a bit like dyslexic, you know, that's a word for people who can't read, and I can't bloody read the word dyslexic, or couldn't spell it. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, and I think this is something that Ringo came up with. Oh, it's been a hard day's night. I think John Lennon heard him say this. This is the testament to the Beatles, this story. So he walks out there and he goes, oh, it's been a hard day's night. And Lennon goes, oh, that's an idea. That's an idea for a song. 4 days later, it's written, it's recorded, it's in the film, it's the name of the film. It's one of the most important songs in rock history. And the Beatles just go, yeah, done. On to the next one. And the next one on my list is the other soundtrack film, Help, which came out in 1965. We're now in full colour. We're getting a little bit of psychedelia in, you know, all sorts of things happening. And these soundtrack albums are very, very important. This, coming out in 65, is a rock album. The sort of echoes of rock and roll, rhythm and blues have gone. And it's the influence of country music coming in, I think. 65, Dylan comes out with Like a Rolling Stone. When I listen to Like a Rolling Stone, it sounds like it's 1975. Dylan has completely changed the landscape and created rock music there. And that, you could hear, whether that track's a direct influence or whether it's in the air. But this album is a rock album, and it is much wider in its scope. It contains these masterpieces: Help, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, which is 6/8, you know, A Ticket to Ride. Yesterday, the most covered and recorded song in history. And there's 2 cover versions on here as well. George Gets 2 Songs, which is I Need You and You Like Me Too Much, along with several nominations for Yesterday. Help was nominated in the category of Album of the Year in 1965 at the Grammy Awards, making the Beatles the first time a rock band had been recognised in this category. It's incredible. This, I think, opens up the second phase of the Beatles' career. From now on, we're going to have albums, and these albums are going to be statements of intent, and they're going to be self-contained, and the album is going to have a message, and it's going to have a feeling that wraps it together as an album. When you start to look at the album artwork's going to change. There's a certain point in the early 60s where albums are like, I'm trying to see if I've got one here I could show you. I've got a few albums here, and I don't think I've got one. No. But if we look at, say, if I take this album here by Sly and the Family Stone, right, look at that. That artwork there, which is coming out in 1970, there's no title, there's nothing, it's just an image. When you go back to 1960s albums, what you're seeing is that you'll see a photograph of the band or the artwork inside like a little window and then graphics around it. The artwork does not go to the edge. When the artwork starts to go to the edge, this is the moment when the album is born. And this happens on the album that I've got at number 6, which is Rubber Soul, which came out a few months later after Help. This is the change. Rubber Soul is an album in itself. The artwork goes to the edge. We've just got the words Rubber Soul. They haven't got the Beatles on. I know this is all visual stuff, but this is important because it shows and explains what the actual change is that happens at this point in time. And now the Beatles are into another place whatsoever. Rubber Soul is one of the greatest albums ever made, right? And yet we're still at number 6 on this ranking. It is absolute genius. If I was to put a subtitle to this album, it would say The Beatles, Rubber Soul, and then the subtitle would be The Beatles Get Stoned. And that's what's happening. Master songwriting, you know, Baby You Can Drive My Car, and you can just hear they're totally in control there. You know, like, you know, baby, you can drive my car, down, 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 and I know you want to be a star, down, 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 baby, you can drive my car, down, 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 baby. And that is brilliant, right? You know the Beatles don't mean it's not about driving a car, is it? This is cool. And when at the end of that they go beep 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 beep, yeah, right, that bit sounds like a car horn. And although it's the cheesiest thing in the world, the Beatles make it cool. And when I put on the album, I was like, my God, how do they get away with this? What else have we got? The subject matter is more philosophical. The drumming is all rock drumming. We've not got sort of rock and roll beats. Nothing like this sounds like this in 1965. There's a Harrison song, which is If I Need Someone, which is played over a polychord. It's a G major over A, which creates like a sort of 7 sus2 chord with an additional, what would it be, 11? And this tends to take you towards the Mixolydian mode. We're seeing modes used here. That Mixolydian mode sounds bluesy and yet Indian. George Harrison is bringing this influence in from India. And I think this influence allows jazz rock fusion to emerge. That's what I believe. There is some really sophisticated vocal arrangements on this. And like, there's a track called Run for Your Life, which has a lyric in it: catch you with another man, you're dead little girl. The Beatles have this lovely, nice image about them. They're all sunshine and nice. And I've never thought this. It's like at the Stones and the Beatles, it's the Beatles you don't want to mess with. And that's a heavy lyric, you know. This contains Norwegian Wood. Norwegian Wood, which is again another mole track. It's in 6/8. It's got sitar on it. This really is 1965. I think this is where we go. Right, progressive rock is on the way. Right. What have I got next on my list of incredible albums? Right. So at number 5, I have got the album The Beatles from 1968, which is known as the White Album. This is a double album. It was recorded after their trip to India. It opens up with Back in the USSR, which is a play on Back in the USA by Chuck Berry, and it also has reference to the Beach Boys. And so this is an ironic commentary, and I think the sort of rock and roll pop music that went before. Back in the USSR has a bite that we haven't heard from the Beatles before. This is the heaviness comes out. There's a track called Glass Onion on here, which is also knowing. They are now looking back. They're older. They're able to comment on what went before. They've grown up. All right. And I think part of this is coming from the tensions that are emerging within the band. They seem to start emerging at this point, but creatively they can't go wrong. Happiness is a Warm Gun is very complex, strange version of a John Lennon. It's like John Lennon's version of prog. It's an incredible song. And on here, at one point, you even have Lennon parodying with his voice Bob Dylan. There's a lot of parodying going on. I can't quite say that today. Martha, My Dear is Paul McCartney's version of prog. I would say this album is one of the very important albums in terms of progressive rock emerging 1968. There's a little bit of filler on here. I think Rocky Raccoon I could have done without. There's also the song Julia by Lennon, which is very beautiful and moving song about his mother. I'm here trying to do a ranking. I'm going through these albums. I've done this a million times before. This has never happened before, and it happened twice on this ranking. So I'm going through this album. This track comes on. I'm listening to it. I burst into tears. That is the power of the Beatles. Side 3 is heavy, especially Your Blues. They sound like Hendrix. They sound like Cream. There's just too much brilliance on this album. Revolution number 9 is perhaps the biggest selling avant-garde music concrete track in history. It's one of those moments where rock music shows what a powerful force it is. I think the other would be a Star Spangled Banner by Hendrix, where what is avant-garde, free, noise, jazz, whatever, avant-garde, suddenly hits the mainstream. There's a track called Good Night, which is also absolutely beautiful. I think it's written by John Lennon. It's got like an orchestral backing by probably George Martin. And Ringo's singing on it. And I love the fact that they give Ringo... What other band does this? You know, it's like, well, we want to involve everybody in this. Ringo's got to have a song in every single album. So I've ranked the 3 greatest. And this one comes in at number 2. I think Ringo Starr's second greatest vocal. At the same time, Hey Jude was recorded, but it wasn't released on this album. It came out as a single. If we got rid of Rocky Raccoon and put Hey Jude on, this could well be vying for number 1. But it's what it's up against. It's nothing about this album. So I'm going to move on to number 4. So at number 4, I have the album that in terms of influence important, I have championed many a time here above things like Sgt. Pepper, and it is Revolver. Revolver to me has always been an incredibly groundbreaking album where their desire to use the studio as an instrument reaches its peak. And it sounds strange when you put it on. It sounds strange. You know no one's playing at the same time. It's got that thing where everything's divided up across the stereo spectrum. It's all very... it's like a collage almost, the way it sounds. Not always, but sometimes. Right, so... at this point, I'm making my notes. There's so many notes about the tracks. Normally, when we rank an album, it goes like two classic tracks on, so you make a note of that. You know, with this, God knows how many classic tracks have you got on here. You got Taxman. I think that opens up the album, which is written by George Harrison, and it says him moaning about the amount of tax they were having. Now they were making money, they were having to pay under the Labour Harold Wilson government, which I think was at 98% at that point. This sounds strange even today. It's got a new wave angular rock sound, right? It's foretelling the future, and we move from that to Eleanor Rigby. I can't think of a mainstream album that swings that much stylistically. Eleanor Rigby, of course, is this strange surrealistic song about being lonely with a string quartet backing it up. This is the idea of the album pushed to the limit. We're not buying a Frank Sinatra and expecting him to get to Frank Sinatra singing. We don't know what we're going to get. We're trusting the Beatles. That's what we're doing at this point. At this point, it's worth noting that George Martin brought in a new 19-year-old kid to help called Jeff Emerick. And I think that this is part of the reason. His youthful experimentalism, I think, helped push this album to where it is. I'm Only Sleeping contains backwards guitar. It's also got the trippy use of vari speed and ADT, which is a way of mimicking vocal double tracking. They use that all over this album, which gives it a slightly sort of mirrored psychedelic sound. If Rubber Soul is the album where they got stoned, this is the album, I think, where they took acid, without a doubt. Love to Love You is this Hindustani influence coming back in, but this time George Harrison has brought real classical Indian classical musicians on here. It's absolutely fantastic, absolutely groundbreaking. We've got Here, There and Everywhere, which is like McCartney's answer to God Only Knows by the Pet Shop Boys, by the Beach Boys. Forget I even said that. So I'm going to just do that one again, but I'm going to leave it in. So I should just do it again. So we've also got Here, There and Everywhere by Paul McCartney, which is his answer to God Only Knows by the Beach Boys, the famous 1960s band, not the Pet Shop Boys, the 80s electro band. Oh, so when you get to mine, it's hard, you know, it's hard wrangling this old brain of mine. I was going to say something about that, can't be asked anymore. We've got Yellow Submarine on here, which, believe it or not, I thought this is the point when Ringo Starr shines, isn't it? No, this is coming at number 3. We've still got number 1 on Ringo's greatest songs. Yellow Submarine is absolutely incredible. This could well mark the beginnings of progressive rock for me. I don't think I've ever thought this before. They're doing all sorts of sound effects. You can hear the seaside, you can hear the bells ringing, and it's like a jolly sea shanty. They were so lucky to have George Martin. George Martin had done all these albums for Peter Sellers and the Goon Show. He was able to stitch together this sort of filmic sound. I have those Peter Sellers albums. They're absolutely incredible. And what we have here is George Martin coming in and doing that on the Yellow Submarine. It's a very successful song, and I think it's a bit of a death knell for the band, because Paul McCartney then wants to write more of these, you know, cheesy little sort of almost like children pop songs, and that creates a stress in the band. You know, when they get to doing Maxwell's Hammer or whatever it's called, that one that's on oh, which album's that on? That's on Abbey Road. You know, they're arguing for months over this track. Anyway, She Said sounds like 90s indie. On this album, it's like, let's invent new wave. That'll come out in the late 70s. And then in the 90s, you'll have this like 90s British indie. So, you know, like Blur and that. Shall we invent that? You know, so that's what She Said sounds like. Good Day Sunshine for No One. McCartney moving away from the band dynamic. Right? You can hear this band is splitting, and you're getting tracks that are entirely made by George Harrison or entirely made by Paul McCartney. Now, at the end of this album is Tomorrow Never Knows. And for me, Tomorrow Never Knows, it could well be the greatest rock song ever made. It's just so groundbreaking. It's like so well thought out, so way out, so heavy, so trippy. What can you say about Tomorrow Never Knows? I need to do a whole video on Tomorrow Never Knows. So we're moving on. We needed to the top 3 now. So at number 3, we have Sgt. Pepper. Now, when I did this, I think Sgt. Pepper, because it got a reputation of being the greatest album ever made. I can remember the 20th anniversary of it in 1987. It was all over the TV. And back then in the 1980s, this was the greatest album ever made. And then, of course, everyone has to come in and go, well, I don't think it is. I think maybe Abbey Road or the White Album is great. And what about Revolver? And there's some weak songs in the middle. We all do. I do this. It's just sort of being iconoclastic. So I came in and thought, oh, Sgt. Pepper, that won't stand up against things like Revolver. And I put it on, and it just hit me, the genius. This is a game changer. This is something else. And I think it's because the whole album is based upon a conceit. This is a band that is now the biggest band in the world, and they've withdrawn from playing live. So they're a band, but they're not a band. And if you're not playing live, what a brilliant idea to create another band and have them play live, and have the conceit that this album is like this weird concert that you've gone to, but it's a concert by this archaic band that exists outside of the realm of rock and roll, that are able to do whatever they want. This is the device. Once you've got this other character, you know, it's like if you invented a character for yourself. You want to try this. If you went into a place you didn't know, and you pretended you were French, and you walked in, hello, I would like a drink, please. Oh, yes, I would like some of the red wine, you know. As soon as you start to do that, you are a different person. And the Beatles, being the biggest band in the world, pull on this sort of fake mask of Sgt. Pepper. And this conceit comes over, and you almost feel like the curtains draw and we're into this concert. And this concert is like trippy, because you can go wherever you want it. This idea is on this and the follow-up album, Magical Mystery Tour, which I've actually ranked higher than this one, so I've given away number 2. So if you know your Beatles albums, you now know what is at number 1. Sgt. Pepper at once breaks the fourth wall and also sets up the pretense of a band pretending to be another band. This is knowing that sort of parodying that we saw on Revolver now turns into a direct Brechtian and alienation effect of you're aware that they know that you're listening, right? And it contains Ringo's greatest song at #1. I've got Get By With a Little Help from My Friends. Sgt. Pepper opens up and you get this, it's like a rallying call. It's like Irving Berlin, you know, you know, Alexander's Ragtime Band. It's that thing which is the first pop song ever. They can't possibly know this. They're still in their mid-20s, but this is groundbreaking. And you get that rally, you know, bam, bam, and you feel the curtains are going in. Come on. It's, you know, no, that's Magical Mystery Tours. And they do it on that as well. How does the Sgt. Pepper start up? It was 21 years today. Bobby Pepper brought the band to play. You know that thing, and it's like that rallying call. And then once you get to that, there's this change in the music, and they actually move from the first track to second track, and it drops down, and we have Ringo Starr, who has up until this point always had his song. He's always had his song that he's sung. They've always written him a song and they've always put him forward. Now he steps up and says, I get by with a little help from my friends. And as a kid, I felt that that's what the song was about. It was about him being supported by his friends in this band. And it's that shift again, the same as Taxman to Ellen Rigby, but this time it all flows. Lucy in the Skies with Diamonds is the embodiment of psychedelia. You got to remember when they're doing Sgt. Pepper, Pink Floyd are next door doing Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and I wonder whether they were comparing psychedelic notes at this point. And we have this thing, you know, where, you know, picture yourself, you know, that line, picture yourself on a... So as they open up this, they're in this concert, but they're giving you permission to imagine other realms. It's multi-dimensional, this album is. This is the concept behind Sgt. Pepper. There's so many concept albums. Dark Side of the Moon, Close to the Edge, isn't it? Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now all this concept, they've invented the album, and they're knowingly turning this thing that they've invented inside out. She's Leaving Home exemplifies the generation gap that underpins the cultural shift going on in 1967. This is one of the greatest songs ever. And that was the second time I burst into tears. So moving. The daughter just wants to be free of her parents. She wants to be out. She wants to live her own life. And she's trying to get out. And at the same time, it's like a film. It cuts to the parents. And the parents go, where's she gone? I'm so worried about it. I just found it so emotional. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. So removed from their rock and roll roots at this point. Complex and twisting Grand Guignol. You could almost hear the influence of Frank Zappa in the middle section of The Benefit of Mr. Coke. When I'm 64, they are reaching across the generation. At one point they're talking about the kid leaving home, and the next minute they're singing about being When I'm 64 in a style which is reminiscent of sort of music hall songs that their parents would know. And this is when the Beatles open their arm to the whole world. It's so inclusive at this point. Sgt. Pepper book ends the album. We've got it at the beginning and we've got it at the end. It's this idea of a performance within a performance, and then you get some of the most mind-bending prog ever recorded. A Day in the Life. Now, A Day in the Life is based upon a guy called Tara Brown, who was the son of a millionaire who was about to inherit millions and millions, and he was friends with the Beatles, and he went out for a drive with his girlfriend, and I think he drove into a lorry, and the opening of that is them dealing with that death. So after all this, we have a song about death. It might say Day in the Life, but it is a song about death, and I think it's a song about the moment of death. If you listen to the lyrics at the beginning, it is a straight description of what happened to Tara Brown when he went and hit, you know, when his being hit the slam into the side of a lorry, and he was killed outright, and the effect that that's going to have. And it's almost like parallels the idea of what happens in that moment. It's, you know, that thing, you know, your life flashes before you. James Joyce, you know, a lifetime contained in one single day. All these things that are now pulled in. This is the highest that rock and roll has ever been as an art form for me. So that's the album I've got at number 3. One of the greatest albums ever made. And it still stands up to me. It's absolutely incredible. Anyone says it's got some filler, where's the filler there? It's incredible. At number 2, I have, as you've guessed, Magical Mystery Tour. Sgt. Pepper comes out, they're the biggest band in the world, and then they flop. The Beatles make their first mistake, which is this weird, psychedelic, trippy Christmas TV special that they've made, which takes this 1960s pretense of getting on the magic bus, you know, that sort of Ken Kesey's bus where you get on it, take acid and go off and trip. But they take that idea and they align to a very English thing, something that was captured so well in the film Carry On at Your Convenience, which is an English trope, which is the sort of working class going on a day trip to the seaside. And they put all that together and create this incredible film that I think is their finest moment. And I've done a whole video on this, and I'll put the link in now. But when the TV show came out, it was in black and white on a tiny little screen and nobody quite knew what was going on. So this has been seen as a bit of a failure. An album didn't come out. They decided to release these tracks as different EPs, so it wasn't released properly. It's now been all pulled together and it's now a CD called Magical Mystery Tour. And looking back on it now, for me, this is definitive Beatles. When I did this list, this was at number 1 all the way. This was going to be at number 1 all the way. How could it not be? When you've got Magical Mystery Tour, Fall on the Hill, I Am the Walrus, Hello Goodbye, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, and All You Need Is Love. This is probably the most definitive Beatles. If you only want to have one Beatles album, it is Magical Mystery Tour. And Strawberry Fields Forever, what they pull off on that is what the Beatles achieved musically. It's all in that, everything. I don't know what much more I can say, you know. It's thought to be unfocused, but I think the Beatles always seemed to move forward when they became filmic, all right? And when they become filmic, that's when the magic happens, right? So we are now at number 1, which is, of course, Abbey Road. Okay, so the thing that's interesting about Abbey Road is they really are in a good way. The band's, you know, I think they start this album out with one of them leaving. In my notes, what have I put here? The album sees the Beatles come together. You see what I did there? And bask in the music form that they have created. This is the album, I feel like, that where they are, in a way, no longer pushing the envelope. The envelope has been pushed and they've gone, seen all these things that we have invented. We could do this with it. You know, that's what Abbey Road seems like to me. But in the end, we're seeing a split with the band and Lennon is now moving away. Paul McCartney is off making tracks on his own, like Fall on the Hill. Fall on the Hill is a solo track. It's not a Beatles track. But it's a work of genius. But there's also, we see the band coming together as a band. We suddenly hear guitar, bass and drums. We hear less of the studio experimentation. I Want You, which is a track on here, is a prog masterpiece. Abbey Road is a progressive rock album, and I Want You is a prog masterpiece. And basically that's them going, you know, in the 90s there'll be this really cool band called Radiohead and they'll sound like this. You know, it's like that type of thing. We'll just do it like 30 years before. When I listen to I Want You, I've written down here, so I'm sat there listening with the headphones and I'm going, and I've written, this is the greatest band of all time. That's what I've written. There's incredible production throughout. We've got complex songs like Here Comes the Sun, which is so catchy. When I was doing this ranking, that was on in the local shop and I was all there. Everyone's sitting there, you know, walking around listening to this, and it's so sophisticated. There's Because, another sublime song. A Song of Hope. And then the medley. I haven't written much about this. I got so taken up by the medley. Because believe it or not, I've never sat and listened to Abbey Road all the way through, which is why it didn't impinge on me. I've listened to it in bits and bobs, but I've never sit down. And that medley in the end, right? And you know what they're trying to do. Now, Lennon poo-pooed this. It's always just bits of ideas. It was bits of ideas. And that is what progressive rock is. You know, Yes had a whole career on bits of ideas cleverly arranged. This is an absolute masterpiece. I didn't want to put it at number 1. I didn't want you know, I didn't want this one at #1, and I'm sat there listening to it, and everyone says this is the best one, but it's not, is it? Then you put it on, and they're just so in control, and they just so know what they're doing. So that is my ranking of the Beatles. I hope I didn't take too long doing it. But I hope you enjoyed this. If you did enjoy this, please like this video. And if you want to see some more, you can subscribe. If you want to support me doing this, then you can support me by becoming a patron. Patreon now, we not have only a ton of extra content, but we also have meetings once or twice a month that end up in the Patreon where you can share ideas. We have guests. We've had some really famous guests. In fact, a guy that actually played on the same bill as the Beatles. We had Bev Bevan in at one point. And we've also set up a Patreon WhatsApp group, which is just, you know, I had a couple of people you know, emailed, said thank you for the Patreon WhatsApp group, because these are music fans and it's really enriched their creative musical life. So if you want to become a patron, that's all there for you. It really is the future of music, I believe, Patreon. But if you don't, you can put some money in my PayPal tip jar. And if you don't want to put some money in my PayPal tip jar, down below is also the link to my Bandcamp page where all my albums and music on there. There's a lot of stuff there. Somebody said I found your Bandcamp and I couldn't believe it existed and you don't mention it. So I'm now going to be mentioning that. So if you want to pass some money on to me and buy an album or get, you know, exclusive streaming rights for an album, you know, check out my Bandcamp. The links are all down below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this new camera and microphone. I hope the quality is a bit better because we've been moaning about that. I've just bought an iPhone basically, so I'm going to have to lean across and switch it off at the end anyway, which I'm about to do now. Let's see, can we find that off button? Are we still going? Yeah. See you all. Bye bye.